Dr. Daniel Lieberman, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
My pleasure. I came across you because I read one of your books, The Molecule of More, a few years ago. I think it's 2019.
That sounds about right, yes.
Yeah. What inspired you to write the book?
The book is all about the brain chemical dopamine. And I had kept coming across dopamine in my medical education and my psychiatric training. We're told that dopamine is responsible for addictions. It's responsible for schizophrenia. It's responsible for attention deficit disorder. And on the surface, all of these illnesses appeared to be so different. And I became very curious. What was the underlying commonality? So I started doing a little bit of digging, and what I found was so fascinating, I felt like I had to share it with the world.
Exactly. And before we dive further into this, how would you introduce yourself?
In what way?
Well, both as a person and as a professional, I guess,
Yeah, boy, that's a pretty
just to gain some
pretty fundamental
background.
question. Yeah. Well, I'm a psychiatrist and I am a scientist that studies the human brain and a clinician that helps people with brain illnesses to heal. That was from my medical school education. But, when I think about the things that drive me, the kinds of ideas that shape my life, I go back a little bit further to my undergraduate days. I went to a somewhat unusual school called St. John's College, where there are no textbooks, there are no lectures, and there are no exams. We read the great books of Western civilization, starting with the ancient Greeks all the way up to modern times, and talk about these books and the ideas they contain in small groups, really grappling with them without the benefit of experts. And so it really gave me a very broad view on human knowledge and what the mind is capable of producing in terms of philosophy, historical investigations, art, science, mathematics, all of those things. And so I think it's really helped me view knowledge not in terms of silos, which you see a lot in academia, a high degree of specialization, but rather more as a unified whole. And I think that that's been very fertile, allowing me to make connections between things that don't necessarily seem connected on the surface.
Do you think you mentioned the working in silos? Do you think that's a problem in medicine?
It is, yes. My son has been struggling with a medical problem. He has a rare genetic disease called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it affects many different parts of the body. And so we didn't know what it was. And so we took him to see a gastroenterologist, doctor for the digestive system, because he was having a lot of problems there. Ran some tests. He said, everything's normal. We said, all right, what should we do? He said, I don't know. Go see someone else. We saw a neurologist, same thing. We bounced from specialist to specialist, and it took us 5 years before somebody was able to put together all the pieces and make the correct diagnosis. So silos are a problem, but I don't know what the solution is because once you have a diagnosis, you want to see the specialist. Medicine is so complex that nobody can master all of the information across all the specialties. So I don't know what the answer is, but maybe we need a better balance.
Yeah. So if we go to dopamine, I think you state that it's about the future and reward. How can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so reward is what most people think about when they think about dopamine. It's what we get when we eat something delicious, when we find a new interesting partner, when we buy a new pair of sneakers. It's that reward. But that's really only a subset of what dopamine does. Dopamine gives us reward when we experience something that makes our future a little bit more secure, perhaps a little bit more prosperous, more interesting. And so dopamine's broader goal is to maximize future resources. So not only does it give us a reward when we do something along those lines, it also gives us motivation. It gives us desire. And in a more modern evolutionary circuit that includes the frontal lobes, it allows us to plan, break down longer-term goals into smaller steps, and accomplish them one by one.
How can it hurt us?
It can hurt us because it's not healthy to have an exclusive focus on the future. You think about perhaps people who are workaholics, and maybe they're very, very wealthy. Maybe they own a beach house, but they're not the kind of person who can go out on the beach, sit back, relax, and enjoy themselves. They've probably got their cell phone or their laptop, and they're working, working, working. And I think to some extent that's true of all of us. We get very excited about buying something new. And we think about it, we read about it, and then we buy it and we forget about it. We're on to the next thing. Or we are really looking forward to spending some time with friends and family. We get with them and our minds are elsewhere. We're not really focused on the present moment. So that's the danger. It can put us into this loop of always seeking and never really taking the time to enjoy the things that we work so hard for.
Yeah. Is this the same as happens with addiction?
Yeah, normal behaviors that stimulate dopamine are targeted towards maximizing future resources. But what drugs of addiction do is they short circuit this whole process and they directly stimulate the dopamine center in a very powerful way. They essentially hijack the motivation system. Now, generally, the more important something is, the larger the dopamine boost it produces, and that can help us choose what's more important, what's giving us the most dopamine. Drugs of abuse are cheating this system. They're using basically a chemical bomb to give as much dopamine as possible, and so it tricks the brain into thinking that these drugs of abuse are more important than family, friends, hobbies, work, and these things are given up. And that's how addiction arises.
Exactly. And there are obviously different types of addiction and how addicted they are. But how do you rate, like, let's say, chocolate, sex, drugs, and different kind of drugs? Where do they range?
Yeah. So, the most obviously addicting drugs are things like cocaine and heroin. Our brains have no defenses against those things. Now, other things like chocolate and sex, well, eating and having sex are normal human behaviors. And so our brains do have circuits that can help us balance and not allow these things to get out of control the way heroin and cocaine use can get out of control. But those checks and balances within the brain don't always work. Maybe there's a problem genetically. Maybe somebody was born with vulnerability to a behavioral addiction. Or maybe they're in a setting of so much stress that they're overwhelmed and they begin seeking the gratification in an unhealthy way. So we do see the kinds of behaviors associated with addiction, with chocolate, with sex, with video games, but it's less common.
Yeah. How does the industry, for example, gaming, big food, etc., how do they use this knowledge about dopamine to get us addicted?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that they do use it. They spend a lot of money hiring experts to figure out ways to reduce their customers' ability to step away, to interfere to some degree with their free will. And it's kind of ugly. It's very unfortunate. But they know what triggers the dopamine system. One thing that's very important is salience. And that means, how relevant is this to me? In normal day-to-day life, it's not always about me. But when something is about me, that's going to give me a bigger dopamine hit because it's going to be more relevant to my success in the future. And so social media companies in particular exploit that. Things like likes and how many likes do you have? How many followers do you have? How many views do you have? And as these counters go up, on one level, we know that they're meaningless, but on another level, they're triggering dopamine, and so they feel important.
Exactly. I remember you wrote in the book about school campaigns against alcohol, drugs, etc., and how they can often be counterproductive. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, drug and alcohol use among young people is a pretty serious problem. And so the government looked into a number of ways to try to manage this problem. And one thing they did was they sent police officers into schools to provide education, to teach kids about the negative effects of these substances. And it didn't work. And in many cases, what happened was they just triggered the children's curiosity. Kids are natural rebels. And if you've got some authority figure up there saying, don't do this, kids' natural reaction is, okay, I am going to do it. And, that was just an illustration of the power of addiction and the kind of challenges we face when we want to try to help people either avoid addiction or overcome it.
Are there possible solutions?
Yeah, what makes a substance addictive has a lot to do with how much dopamine it produces, but that's not the only factor. There's nothing we can do about that. We can't make smoking cigarettes produce less dopamine. But what we can do is we can address other aspects of addiction. And one that has a surprisingly large effect is access. So I think pornography is a good example of this. When I was young, the only way to get pornography was to go to your local drugstore, pick up a magazine off the shelf, and bring it up to the front desk and present it to the cashier. And that was not an easy thing to do. So there was a natural barrier, and I think that people were less likely to get into trouble with out-of-control pornography use in those days. Today, pick up your phone, turn on your computer, and there's unlimited pornography available. And as a result, it's become a very serious problem. And so that's the issue of access. So with cigarettes in particular, we see this very clearly. All kinds of things were tried. Advertisements on public transportation telling people how dangerous smoking is, warnings on the packages themselves, celebrities telling people not to smoke. None of this had any effect at all. What did have an effect was raising taxes on cigarettes. Another effect was restricting the stores in which it could be sold. And the biggest effect of all was engineering society to condemn cigarette smokers. If you were a smoker, people would look down on you as being either uneducated or having no willpower, and that was the strongest of all. So addictions are so tough. In a lot of cases, we don't address them head on. We have to kind of look at the environment in which they exist.
So peer pressure, just what should I say, the other way around?
Yeah, that's extremely effective. If you're in a peer group that doesn't use drugs, you have a really good chance of not using drugs yourself. And the opposite is unfortunately true as well.
Exactly. And what about you spoke about it earlier, ADHD? I'm interested in what is it, and what kind of role does dopamine play, and also the drugs used to treat it. How does they play a role?
To understand ADHD, we have to look at the dopamine system in a little bit more detail. There are more than one dopamine circuits in the brain. The one we've really been focusing on is one that's deep, deep inside a primitive part of the brain called the limbic system. And in the book, I call it the desire circuit. It's a circuit that makes us want things. It gives us motivation, and very, very important. But it can also get out of control and lead to addiction. Now, that's in an ancient part of the brain. There's one, as I mentioned, in a newer part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. And I call that one the control circuit. That drives the frontal lobes just behind the forehead. The control circuit is also focused on maximizing future resources, but it takes a longer term view. So the desire circuit might say, I'd like a piece of cake. But the control circuit might say, well, that sounds nice, but our longer term goal is to be healthy, so let's say no to the piece of cake. So in many instances, the control circuit will oppose the desire circuit and say that's good for short-term gain, not for long-term gain. But they can also work together. The desire circuit can say, I want this, and the control circuit can say, all right, let's make a plan in order to figure out how to get it. Example of them working together. The control circuit also helps us visualize things that don't have a material existence. The future is hypothetical. Future is imaginary. Only the present is real in a material sense. And so the ability to think about the future, which is unreal, also allows us to think about abstract concepts. Things like mathematics, the laws of nature, concepts of justice. And so the control circuit allows us to do that as well. And that's an enormously powerful thing. Understanding math and science has allowed the human race to dominate the world. Yeah. So the problem with ADHD is a lack of dopamine in this control circuit. And so as a result, people have difficulty with organization. They have difficulty with long-term planning, focus, concentration, and impulsivity. That control circuit is not able to say no as effectively. And so children with ADHD will grab toys, they'll cut in line. Adults with ADHD will interrupt others. They'll spend money in unwise ways. So the drugs we use to treat it are drugs that preferentially increase dopamine in this control circuit. And there's controversy about them because in some situations they're overprescribed, but as a psychiatrist, I have seen them absolutely change lives for the better and allow very intelligent, very creative people who had been held back by lack of a good control circuit just absolutely blossom in their work and their relationships.
How different is ADHD if your brain is not developed fully yet compared to a fully developed brain?
Yeah, that's a great question. The frontal lobes, the control circuit, is not fully developed until someone is in their early 20s. And that's why adolescents are impulsive and not so good at long-term thinking. It develops more slowly in boys than in girls. And so I think in many situations, educators and perhaps parents will misinterpret a developing frontal lobe as a pathological illness, ADHD. And they'll take boys who are engaging in ordinary behaviors, but, maybe boy behaviors are not always welcome in things like schools. They're loud, they're rambunctious, they're disorganized, they're impulsive. These are normal behaviors for boys. But they're often unwelcome. They're compared to girls who are able to function better at a younger age in a school-structured environment. And they're said, you have ADHD, you need to be medicated. And in many situations, that's just not true.
Exactly. Do you have any proposals for what you're talking about there, the education system and how to differentiate between the genders?
Yeah, I think that, one thing that we know is that both girls and boys do better in single-sex educational environments. I think that boys and girls need a chance to socialize with one another, but maybe separation in academic classes is more effective. I think that there just needs to be more of a realization that boys are not girls and that boys lack some of the strengths girls have, but they have strengths that girls do not. And I think those should be appreciated and celebrated. But, as a physician, one of my main focuses is that we need better diagnosis of ADHD. We can't put somebody in a brain scanner or take a blood test. If we could do that, and I think we're moving towards that, doing EEGs, measuring electrical activity in the brain and running them through certain computational algorithms. If we could do that, then we could say, this is normal behavior. We need to find ways to live with it. This is illness behavior. We need to approach it from a medical standpoint.
Are there other tools than drugs and maybe like you talked about separating girls and boys in school? Are there other tools that parents can use to help their children?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody doesn't have ADHD and they're an ordinary boy, then I think the best tool is reading about normal boy behavior. So you don't blame this child for having a boy brain. But if somebody actually does have ADHD, there are a lot of environmental things you can do to make it easier for the person to manage. And these can really increase the effectiveness of medication. But in cases of genuine ADHD, I don't think that these are a substitute for medication. Medication can be frightening. As we've talked about, it's overused in some cases. But when you have a medical illness, withholding effective medical treatment is not a good idea. Person is not going to reach their full potential, and I think you really need to use it in an effective way.
Yeah. What kind of role does exercise play?
Exercise, exercise plays a very big role. It's not something I'm an expert in, but it calms the brain down. And so you don't have this franticness of the brain going in all different directions that you can see in ADHD. People with ADHD are distractible because they're very, very revved up in some ways. And exercise sort of works that off, and they calm down and they can be more focused. Exercise also helps people learn discipline, and that can be helpful with ADHD. And maybe most importantly of all, people with ADHD find it harder to find normal gratification. A lot of times they have difficulty with peer relationships. They're interrupting, grabbing, not waiting their turn. They're not getting gratification from school in terms of good grades. So if they can get gratification from exercise, that's very, very important. It's going to make them less likely to turn to unhealthy sources of gratification like drugs or early sexual experimentation.
We spoke earlier about social media, but how does the digital environment today hijack or overstimulate the dopamine system?
Yeah, we don't read books anymore. And it's a shame. When you read a book, you sit down to a somewhat significant project. You're not going to do it in a sitting. You're not going to do it in a day. You stick with it, and you enter into ideas in a very deep and profound way. Today, nobody reads books. We don't even read blog posts anymore. We read posts. A few sentences, maybe a couple of paragraphs. And we're not developing our capacity for critical thinking, our capacity for developing, analyzing, and understanding complex ideas. So I make an effort to read books. I strongly encourage my patients and my kids to read books. I think that the digital environment is leading to fragmentation of thought. And people think that they know a lot of things because they've got a lot of random facts. But really what they're doing is they're just parroting ideas other people have given them. They're not really going deeply into it and saying, what does this mean from the unique perspective that I have, the unique values that I have? How can I make this personal in terms of understanding? And it's a shame. It's a shame that we're doing that to ourselves.
Yeah. I work, or my main work is football coach or soccer. How does dopamine relate to winning and losing? What kind of effect does it have?
Yeah. So, from a neuroscience perspective, team sports is absolutely fascinating. Typically, going through, the complement of dopamine focusing on the future are chemicals in the brain that focus on the here and now, the present moment. And the things that happen in the present moment are things like sensations. We see, hear, taste, and touch. It's bodily movements, right? We move our body in the present moment. It's relationships. We interact with other people, and it's also emotions. I think our society is absolutely obsessed with dopamine, with things like anticipation, excitement, desire, those kinds of things. But the here and now things are very important. Now, in most situations, we're in either one or the other. If I'm at work, I'm kind of in dopamine mode. I'm working on a project to make someone's future better. If, on the other hand, I'm at home with my family, I should be in here and now mode. Enjoying their companionship, listening to what they say, sharing emotions with them. Now, the peak of human functioning is when both of these systems are active, working together. And you see that in team sports. The dopamine aspect is the motivation to win, and also the strategy. The strategy is dopamine. How am I going to do this pass? Where am I going to put my players? Which people do I want on the field? This is dopamine. You're strategizing for a goal in the future to win the game. So plenty of great dopamine in a football game, but there's also a ton of here and now. There's the individual player's body, which he has trained for thousands of hours to do what he wants it to do. There is the sensations, the data that this person is taking in order to determine what their actions are. And perhaps most importantly, there's the coordination with the other people. There's a huge emphasis on relationships in team sports. So my son was a football player for a while, and he was absolutely obsessed with it. It gave him more pleasure than anything else in life. And I think the reason it is so pleasurable is because it activates both systems simultaneously, and that's very rare.
Yeah. You say something in the book about lower level thinking is about what happens here and now and concrete here and now, and you talk about higher level thinking, which is more abstract, thinking about the future. When I read that, I was just thinking about, like, if you want to perform at your best in sports, you don't want to think too much, at least not abstract and critical. So how can this affect the performance for a footballer, for example?
Yeah, yeah. I think that question speaks to the second book that I wrote called Spellbound, and it's about the unconscious mind. When we think of our minds, we really think about something that we have the ability to control. I can think about anything I want. I can think about elephants. I can think about cookies. It feels like I'm in control up there. But that's an illusion. In fact, the vast majority of things that our brain does is outside of our control. So, for example, if I want to walk across the room, I give the order, walk over there, but I'm not coordinating each individual muscle. Each muscle has millions of fibers that are actually being controlled individually, and that's far too complex a task for the conscious mind. We have to leave that to the unconscious mind. And you can see this clearly when you're learning a new skill. So, for example, I played tennis a little bit when I was a kid, and I remember being taught how to swing the racket. Start low, bring it forward, bring it up, connect with the ball, and follow through. All right, great. Memorize it. I know it. I make my arm do it, and it's absolutely horrible. Because my conscious mind stinks at muscle control. The only way to get good at it is to move that skill into the unconscious mind, and the only way to do that is through repetition. I've got to do it 10,000 times, and then I do it without thinking about it. So I think the point you're making is that when it comes to bodily coordination, that's not a job for the conscious mind. And if the conscious mind tries to take over control by thinking about the movements, it's going to ruin everything. You got to do something 10,000 times, make it unconscious, or we also say muscle memory, and then you're using your brain properly.
Yeah, makes sense. Your research and the way has that changed the way you approach your own life, work, goals, relationships, etc.?
Yeah. As I was writing this book, I realized that I was really spending too much time in my dopamine circuits, that I was always thinking about what's next, what's next. I was always anxious about making sure everything doesn't fall apart next week. I've got to keep everything together. And I realized that wasn't healthy for me, and I wasn't really enjoying the things that I had worked so hard for. So I started a meditation practice, about 20 minutes once a day in the morning. Tried to be a little bit more mindful, and so I've been meditating for I don't know, about 7 years now, and it's still incredibly difficult for me. I think I'm naturally very dopaminergic. To sit there and not let my mind wander about what's next is hard. But I have partial success, and I think it helps me be more centered, a little bit more calm.
Yeah, because that was my follow-up question, what your thoughts were about meditation.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah,
meditate?
I do since 2018.
Yeah. It takes a
Yeah,
long time to get good at it, doesn't it?
it does, but I don't know, I think it helps with a lot of stuff. That's
Yeah.
my feeling, at least. What about autism? You write a bit about autism. How does dopamine relate to that?
Yeah, autism is a very serious illness in which there are many, many things that are not going right in the brain. It's an illness that I don't personally specialize in. It's something that child psychiatrists tend to focus on more. So I think I've only treated one patient who has very mild autism. So I'm not going to be able to be as intelligent about that as I wish I could.
Yeah, no problem. I remember a quote in your book: dreams are brief madness, and madness a long dream. What does that mean?
So we've talked about dopamine in terms of ADHD. We need it for focus, concentration, impulse control. We've spoken about it in terms of addictions. The dopamine system gives us desire and motivation, and that can be hijacked by drugs. Dopamine is also involved in psychosis, illnesses like schizophrenia, madness, to put it in formal terms. What's going on there is that, dopamine tells us, we talked a little bit about salience. Is this important to me? Is this something that's going to make my life better? And dopamine can help us make new connections. Things that didn't appear to be important actually are important. But if that circuit is broken, if it's working in a pathological way, it can make us think that things are personal when they're really not. So, for example, if I'm watching a news show and my salience dopamine circuit suddenly goes off for no reason at all, I might think that guy's talking to me. Or if I hear about a spy agency investigating an organization, I might think, oh my God, that spy agency is investigating me. If I see two people across the room and they're whispering, my dopamine system might say they're talking about me. And that's paranoia. Now, if you step back just a few inches from insanity, what you have is brilliant creativity. The ability to see connections between things that are invisible to ordinary people. And so that's the link between dopamine, creativity, and madness. And if you look at the most brilliant scientists and the most brilliant artists, many of them became insane later in life, or they had children with serious illnesses. Einstein, for example, had a son with schizophrenia, and he spent his life in a mental institution. Sir Isaac Newton, arguably one of the most important scientists in all of history, spent a year in an insane institution because he became paranoid. So brilliance and madness are on a razor's edge away from one another. And the reason is dopamine.
That's interesting. Are there ways to increase creativity?
I think there are. Yeah. Creativity is driven by dopamine. And so if you make yourself want something very, very badly, you're more likely to come up with creative solutions to attain it. We have a saying in English, necessity is the mother of invention. Have you ever heard that? Yeah. So if something is really, really important, then there's going to be a lot of dopamine, and that's going to drive not only the motivation to solve the problem, but it's also going to give you new creative ideas. There, many, many artists and even scientists have spoken about finding solutions to difficult problems in dreams. I write about the famous chemist Kekulé, who discovered the structure of the benzene atom in a dream. Lots of songwriters will say that the idea for this song came to me in a dream, because in a dream, dopamine is unconstrained. Desire dopamine is, and that's why dreams are so bizarre. The control dopamine circuits that make sense of the world are basically shut down, and so the desire circuit runs wild, and we have these bizarre experiences. But it can also solve problems. And so if you want to try to increase the odds that a dream is going to solve a problem that you're struggling with, before you go to bed, think about how important it is to solve this problem. Think about how great it's going to be if you can come up with a creative solution. That's going to prime the dopamine system, and that'll make it more likely.
Is this the same that can happen when you go for a walk without all the external stimuli, for example, in nature, etc.?
Yeah, exactly. I've got mixed feelings about that. So, on the one hand, you could take a nature walk and be very focused on being in the present, hearing the birds sing, smelling the sounds, etc. And that's going to be very, very good for your mental health. But you're not going to come up with any creative ideas because you're focusing on here and now and you're shutting down dopamine. If, on the other hand, you take a walk and you don't pay attention to your surroundings, you just let your mind wander, it's not going to make you happier. It's not going to make you mentally healthier, but you might get a creative idea, because in that situation, you are privileging dopamine. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, exactly, as most things. Mental health. How would you define that?
Yeah, so I think I would go with the psychoanalytic formulation of mental health. And they say it's the ability to work, to love, and to play. So it's the ability to be productive, to do things that benefit other people and society. To love, it's the ability to have satisfying relationships, to be able to have emotional intimacy with other people, and to play. It's the ability to enjoy your leisure time, to have fun, to have hobbies, to grow as a person outside of just work and relationships. I think that's what mental health is.
Are there any other things we haven't touched upon that you would like to mention?
You know, we haven't touched on love, which was the first chapter in the book because we thought it was so important.
Yeah.
Dopamine drives love. Dopamine gives us desire to connect with other people. And when we fall in love, we enter a hyper dopaminergic state in which our dopamine system is so active. People have said that being in love is perhaps the most pleasurable experience human beings ever have. one of the points we made in the book is that, that's a wonderful, wonderful experience, but you've got to recognize it's time limited.
Yeah.
On average, being in love, what we might call passionate love, only lasts about 12 months. When it goes away, two things can happen. People can say, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. This isn't the right person after all. I need to go find someone new. That's the immature way of doing it. Chasing the dopamine. You're going on the roller coaster ride again and again and again. It doesn't matter how many times you do it. It's still never going to last forever. A better approach is to allow this dopamine love to evolve into a here and now love. Passionate love becomes companionate love. And that's when this person, companionate, they're your best friend. They're someone that you trust, someone you can count on, someone who knows you better than anyone else and who will always be there to support you. And it might not be as immediately pleasurable as passionate love, but in terms of the effect on a person's quality of life, their long-term happiness, maybe that's even more powerful. And so I think that our society, movies, books, all kinds of things, it celebrates passionate love, does not celebrate companionate love. And so we really wanted to let people know, hey, pay attention to what your brain's doing. Passionate love is wonderful, but your brain can't keep it up forever. You also need to learn about the value of companionate love.
Yeah. Important point. And I saw you have a new book coming up.
Yeah,
What's it
that's
about and
actually,
when's it coming out?
yeah, it's actually not my book. For the sequel, my co-author, Mike Long, took over.
Okay.
And coincidentally, it's out today. Today's the release day. It's called
Nice.
Taming the Molecule of More.
I'll be sure to get that.
Terrific.
So one last question. What is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life? It's a tough question. I think the meaning of life is growth. That it's not about what you have or what you've accomplished. It's about where are you headed? Are you becoming a better person? Are you expanding your capacity to love? Are you expanding your connection to other people? Are you expanding your ability to be productive, to be fertile, to produce, to be creative? And, the sad thing about being a human being is that we only experience growth through pain, suffering, and failure. When things are going well, we go, okay, everything's great. We don't change. We don't learn anything from our successes. We only learn from our failures. We only become better people as a result of overcoming challenges. Just like you can't build muscles if you don't push against resistance. If you only lift light weights, easy things, your muscles will never get bigger. I think it's the same with life. If you don't face challenges, if you don't experience pain and loss, you're not going to grow as a person. So, one of the things as a psychiatrist that I do is I try to help people to see that the suffering they're trying to overcome, by all means, we should try to overcome that suffering, but we should also see that it has value.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated it.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you. Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.